I think Turner typified, in a way, the emerging black leader that begins to emerge in the 20th century and that really takes its position at the time of the civil rights. In other words, Turner is now part of the generation from which Thurgood Marshall would come. I can see my father in Turner. My father was also a professor. He was younger than Turner by 20 years, but still that same, these were men who were the first generation of blacks. They were not born in slavery. They were born of slave parents who had been in slavery. But these were the first generation of the few, the very few, but nevertheless the few, who went to college and began to get advanced degrees and began to assert themselves. And Turner was part of that. He was part of that generation. And I think it says a lot that he was a Catholic, because most of them, those leaders, were not Catholic.
The 1990s, of course, is a devastating period in African-American history. It's the period of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court in 1896, in which separate but equal segregation becomes accepted by the highest court of the land. It's a period when lynchings are mounting to unfortunate proportions.
People don't realize what lynching was like. Lynching was the putting to death, usually by hanging. Sometimes the body was burned while still alive and hanging on the tree. Of suspected criminals, this black was accused of raping a white woman, and they dragged the person out of the prison, string him up on a tree, kill him. Sometimes they tortured him while he was still alive, and so forth. The atrocities were immense, and this whole system of lynching increased as we moved to the end of the century and into the 20th century. It didn't decrease.
Now, while the Black Catholic Congresses in the 19th century ended in 1895 with the last Congress, Black Catholic lay activism did not die. It continued on. Particularly, it was expressed institutionally in the leadership of Thomas Wyatt Turner.
He was born as the fifth of 9 children in Hughesville, which is in Charles County, Maryland. He lost his father at an early age, and so his mother was faced with the necessity of having to farm out a number of her children to relatives, and Turner went as a young boy to live with his aunt and uncle. His rural education in southern Maryland was not extensive, but he had a great opportunity as a young boy to attend an Episcopal school at Charlotte Hall. And there he met a wonderful Episcopal priest and also a very wonderful young female teacher who recognized very early his talents and gave him an opportunity for a broad-based liberal education. He recalled the teacher giving him lessons in French and opening up whole new worlds for him of possibility. A very important event in his life as a young boy was that when he finished education in this school, he had an opportunity offered to him by the Episcopal priest to attend that priest's alma mater, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. But the requirement for him was that if he were to take the scholarship, he had to convert from his Roman Catholic faith, into which he'd been born and baptized, to the Episcopal Church. The intriguing aspect of this story is that he didn't feel comfortable asking questions of his aunt and uncle about this choice. But felt that he needed to seek out advice from some other neighbor or friend who might be able to help him. And there was a wonderful Quaker woman in that community for whom he had a lot of respect. And so he decided to ask her the question of what he ought to do about his opportunity and his faith. And he described this to me personally at this late stage in his life as a moment in which she just asked him simply, "Do you love your church?" And he said yes. And she said, "Stick with it and you'll get by." He took that advice, determined that he would have to turn down the scholarship, and then began to look elsewhere for opportunities for education. That led him to a decision to leave Southern Maryland, go a few miles up the road to Washington, D.C., and enter Howard University.
And he was a professor at Howard University at the time of the First World War. And around 1913, responding to some of the complaints of many of the black soldiers who were Catholics, he had organized a committee. At that time, there was no USO. What you had was the YMCA took care of the recreational needs and the other needs of servicemen. The white YMCA took care of white Protestant soldiers. The black YMCA took care of the black Protestant soldiers. And the Knights of Columbus, which was a strictly white organization, took care of the white Catholic soldiers. But there was no one who was really taking any care or responsibility for the black Catholic soldiers.
And so he approached what was then the National Catholic War Conference, which was established during World War I, later become the NCWC, the National Catholic Welfare Conference of the American Bishops after the war, and asked how he might help resolve that dilemma. And a system was then set up to provide social services to black Catholic soldiers during the war. Obviously for Turner, it was simply an entry point into the larger issue of discrimination within the church.
This climate of racial animosity, and many openly talked about a race war that would ensue. And in fact, it almost did in 1919, when you talk about the Red Summer, when black soldiers who had gone to France, to Europe, to fight in the World War I, as battle-hardened veterans come back and find themselves submitted to the 1,001 indignities which segregation laws created, and to the climate of violence in which blacks in many parts of the South were living in, and where there was mortal fear on the part of whites that these blacks who have perhaps been introduced to a society in which there are no racial segregation laws are going to come back over to the United States now and insist on that same kind of liberty. That climate just erupted in a series of very, very bloody riots in Arkansas and Chicago. And it was terrible. And the intriguing thing about this, again, is to show the place of Rome. Benedict the 15th was Pope. To the apostolic delegate, he sent messages that the bishops who were going to assemble in 1919 in Washington, D.C., and form themselves into a permanent organization, which was the NCWC. It was a very, very important meeting, and the bishops saw this as an extremely important meeting. But Benedict XV was also insisting that the bishops must address this issue of the rioting and the bloodshed in the United States, because he personally was disturbed by it, and felt that the Cardinal Mundelein of Chicago, where there had been a terrible, terrible race riot, had to say something. The bishops had to say something. They didn't. They made some very, very vague allusions, not at all sympathetic, by the way, to the problem of blacks. But they were much more concerned about the this new organization was being established and so forth. And it strikes you as you read this. It struck me at least. Here was the Pope in Rome. You always complain about Rome. You always complain about the fact they don't seem to be they're way away and don't know what the local situation is. Where almost any kind of objective viewer would say they are much more aware of the real pastoral problems than is the case for the bishops here in the country. He has organized a kind of a National Association for the Advancement, almost, of black Catholics. And with that, they were going to really become a recognized group within the Catholic Church on behalf of blacks.
This kind of organizational development was not dissimilar from certainly organizational development within the Catholic Church itself in terms of Catholic action organizations and societies. Turner himself had belonged to the Holy Name Society in his own parish. But it also was quite similar to the growing development of organizational structures for black organizations like the NAACP, of which Turner himself was a charter member.
The Federated Colored Catholics took up many of the causes that the old African American Catholic Congresses under the leadership of Dan Rudd had taken up. Issues of segregation of Catholic schools, and Turner spoke out very forcefully against the exclusion of black youth from Catholic universities, for example, St. Louis University and Notre Dame and a number of others. He also spoke out against the racism within the Catholic Church, and in a memorable phrase talks about how if segregating and oppressing Catholics are to be the norm due to concern about prudence, and remember that prudence was always the old excuse that we have to act slowly, that we have to act prudently, that we can't push this issue of equality too rapidly because we'll lose the goodwill of white Catholics. Attacking that notion of prudence, Turner says, if all of the church should become segregating and oppressing, we will trod the winepress alone and holding untainted the banner of Christ. So a very strong sense that this is our church, that we will not leave this church, and that it is indeed segregationists within the church who are corrupting the true message of Christ and defiling the body of Christ.
The conventions of the Federated Colored Catholics, starting about 1925 and 26, I think give you some feel for the issues which the Federation was attempting to deal with and the methodologies that they began to employ that they thought would be effective in making change within the church. Their goals then in the beginning were very simple. They wanted to find effective ways to deal with the highest level of hierarchical structure within the church, that is the bishops, and make their voice known in order to remove the discrimination that existed in participation in ordinary Catholic life, which had to do with separate doors, seating in the back of churches, in some cases the establishment of separate churches because white churches would not accept black members into their churches.
He also wanted to know why they weren't more black priests. That was a very sensitive issue. And Steve Oakes wrote his marvelous book on desegregating the altar, in which he points out that in fact the Josephites had a systematic program of no longer accepting black men as a priest in the Josephite community. Though this was not to be publicized in any way, or anyone should know about this, but that was the reality. to the point that by the 1920s, you have about only 2 or 3 black priests still living in the United States. There was agreement we were not going to have any more black priests. Diocesan bishops would not accept black men for the diocesan priesthood. Religious communities, again, like the Jesuits, absolutely categorically would not accept blacks. That was the situation, and it's in that kind of atmosphere, you might say, where a man like Turner says, we are not, that this is not the place to sit down and chat and talk and reason. It's a place to make your demands. We're to point out that this is an evil, that this is not Catholic teaching, this kind of thing, and that these are things that have to be changed. And he was quite correct about, this is not the place to be gentlemanly about it, because you're not going to change anything, and so forth. And it is a place for blacks to make known what needs to be done.
So with Turner and the Federated Colored Catholics, we find another example of black lay activism that would grow up in the 19-teens and would continue down into the 1950s, though it would continue down with some interesting difficulties. And the difficulties have to do with conflicts between Turner and 2 white Catholic priests who were activists all of their lives in the cause of racial justice. These 2 priests were 2 Jesuits, Father William Marco, who was active in St. Elizabeth's Parish, in a black parish in St. Louis, Missouri, and Father John Lafarge, who became editor of America magazine. Both of these Jesuits, Lafarge and Marco, were very interested in developing the Interracial Apostolate. That is, arguing that Catholics needed to become aware of the social teachings of the Church on issues of race, and that racism was wrong, and that the way to overcome racism was to educate Catholics, both black and white, through joint meetings, through discussions, through meeting in one another's homes, through common prayer, through retreats, to educate Catholics to the need for interracial cooperation and interracial awareness and racial justice. Both priests place a tremendous amount of trust in education, that racism was basically a matter of ignorance.
And he wanted an organization where whites and blacks could sit down, in a sense, and talk and discuss. I always felt that Lafarge always felt that you could solve any problem if we had tea together. And I think that's the way he thought. We'll intellectualize. Turner realized you can't do that, because the question of racism was not a question not just an intellectual question. It was a question on all kinds of levels, including the gut level. And that therefore it had to be handled in a very forthright and deliberate way.
For Turner, this was a black organization, and there were no problems with that. Black Catholics had an identity. For Marco and for Lafarge, this smacked of reverse racism. And so here we get one of the ongoing problems within American society is, how does one have a black organization that speaks for itself and yet is not perceived as an institution that continues racism?
Turner was a man before his time in the sense that it's important, if blacks are going to be doing something, that they take the responsibility and also the leadership. We must no longer be under the tutelage of whites. I mean, he never said it, he never spelled it out that way, but that's exactly what he meant.
Marco, who was early on involved with the Federated Colored Catholics, offered his own parish journal, St. Elizabeth's Chronicle it was called, to be the official journal of the Federated Colored Catholics. He did this very intentionally, very knowingly, with the premise, the suggestion, that the name of the journal would become the Interracialist. And he very subtly, but very forcefully, began to push the institution, the organization, to become an interracial organization. And a good number of black Catholics, a good number of members of the Federated Colored Catholics supported this idea. The eventual unintended consequence of that was for Turner, who objected to it, to actually be voted out of leadership of the organization that he had founded, and then for the organization to split into two organizations, with the Federated Colored Catholics sadly diminished in numbers, continuing down into the 1950s when it ceased to exist, and with the interracialist movement continuing on. Eventually, the strongest wing of it was in New York, the group that had been organized by Father John Lafarge. So there was a tragic kind of falling out here, of disagreement among men of goodwill. None of these were evil men. They all were of goodwill. They were trying by the best of their lights to solve what was a very complex and very deeply ingrained problem within American society and within the American Catholic Church. But not unsurprisingly, given their backgrounds, they saw it in very different ways.
Intriguing to me is that that period of the 40s and 50s, with this sort of interracial approach, let white Catholics understand what this issue is by talking with willing black Catholic members as members of the interracial organization, meant a hiatus from the 1930s black organization to the 1960s sort of resurgence of black Catholic voice, beginning with the black Catholic clergy in the death of Martin Luther King in 1968 and the subsequent development of the National Office of Black Catholics, a unique black voice within the Catholic Church that followed. There's almost a silence through the 40s and 50s and early 60s of that unique black Catholic voice. Dr. Turner's relationship with Catholic University was a very long one. After he finished studies at Howard University in 1901, he felt that he did not have enough of an education in science to be a good science teacher, which is what he had determined he wanted to do as his profession. So he entered the Catholic University of America for an advanced degree in science in 1901, but soon had to leave the university because he really didn't have sufficient funds to continue his studies there. Later, as a Howard University professor, about 1915, he had a young black student from Atlanta, Georgia, who came to visit him. And what the student explained to him is that he had tried to enter the Catholic University and had been told by university officials that he should go see this black professor at Howard who might be able to help him out. Implying, of course, that this young man was not welcome at the Catholic University about 15 years after this professor, Turner, had himself been a student there. It took well into the 1930s before a student was once again admitted. But every year of the Federation's existence, beginning with the committee in 1915 and its final establishment in 1925 as an organization, members worked on that issue of education broadly, but specifically on the Catholic University. In the years that the organization had as its policy personally to lobby the bishops in their meetings, in their annual meetings at the university in November of each year, admission to the university was on the agenda. The great irony is that in 1976, Thomas Wyatt Turner himself, as a leader of these efforts to combat discrimination in the church, was granted an honorary degree. And as I stood by his side in the bestowing of the honor, I was struck by the irony. When Cardinal Baum approached Dr. Turner simply to introduce himself, Turner, who was blind, lifted his head and said, "Oh, the Archbishop of Washington. I have been speaking with the archbishops and cardinals of Washington and Baltimore since Cardinal Gibbons." Cardinal Baum was astounded, I think, by the remark, because it represented such a long history of relationship with the clergy. But I think understanding of the historic moment that he himself was experiencing in this introduction.
I mean, he had been honored by a Catholic university. They gave him an honorary degree when he was over 100 years old. But in a sense, there wasn't a great deal of fanfare when he died. It was an acknowledgement in the press and so forth. But as far as blacks were concerned, they hardly knew who he was, in a sense. That's regrettable. That's regrettable.
I think this issue of separate or together has been a perennial issue for the church in the United States and elsewhere. And I would say that has not only been a black and white issue, although that's been one of the primaries, it's also been an issue for ethnic groups of all sorts within the American Catholic Church. Then in the late 60s, black Catholics began to come alive, as it were, in terms of organizations and the issues of black culture and black consciousness. The formation that was very significant of a black Catholic clergy caucus, and a black Catholic Sisters Caucus, and a lay caucus, and then the National Office of Black Catholics. And it was out of these groups that grew the Black Catholic Congress of 1987.
We're not a church, I don't think, in decline. And I think that the presence of black Catholics, or presence of any of the minorities, is a sign of this. So I see great signs of hope. John 23rd is still correct. It is a Pentecost, and the church is a church of diverse people. It is truly Catholic. At the end of the 20th century, the Catholic Church is more Catholic, more universal than perhaps it has been in its history. People talk openly about when will it happen that we'll have perhaps an African Pope. No longer is anyone going to look at one with consternation, which brings me to the point, the Church of the Millennium will be a church of color. And I think that's rather fantastic.